HHT webinar entitled Research Roundtable, an inside look at exciting clinical trials underway in HHT. My name is Riley Blevins. I'm the Director of Marketing and Communications at the Foundation, and I will be moderating tonight's event. Before we get underway, to make this event as interactive as possible, I first want to go through some housekeeping items and show you around Zoom. First, all microphones have been muted and all participant video cameras have been turned off so you can focus on the speakers and their presentations. If you have a question for one of the presenters, please type it into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. We recommend that you keep your questions general in nature so they benefit everyone. I will ask as many questions as time allows at the end of the event. Our team will also be moderating the chat and will post resources relevant to tonight's topic in the chat box. You can use Zoom chat to make comments to all participants on the webinar, but please do not post questions for the presenters in the chat box. All presenter questions should be typed directly into the Q&A box. This presentation will be recorded and the recording will be saved in the Cure HHT website's resource library. And at the end of the discussion, you'll be directed to take a survey. Your input is critical for the development of future webinars, so please take a few minutes to give us your feedback. As a final item, I wanted to let attendees know about two upcoming HHT Academy patient and physician conferences. We are so excited to be back hosting in-person events once again, and wanted to let you know that we will be hosting a regional conference just outside Denver, Colorado on March 25th. And our national conference will be held in Seattle, Washington from June 3rd and 4th. So please do save those dates, as there is simply no better way to stay up to date on the latest in HHT than by attending these events. Please visit our website to learn more. And with that, we will hit record and get started. So welcome once again to tonight's webinar, Research Roundtable, an exciting look at exciting clinical trials underway in HHT. Again, my name is Riley Blevins, Director of Marketing and Communications at Cure HHT. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce our speakers tonight. First, we have Cassie Friday, who is the Director of Research Programs and Grants for Cure HHT. Cassie recently joined our team, and we are so thrilled to have her after recently completing her PhD from the University of Kentucky. Cassie is also a caregiver for her husband and two of her 3 children who have HHT. Next, we're thrilled to be joined by Dr. Marie Faunin. Dr. Faunin is a pulmonologist and the director of the HHT Center of Excellence at St. Michael's Hospital in Toronto, Canada. Dr. Faunin is the lead principal investigator for the Brain Vascular Malformation Consortium study, better known as BVMC. Dr. Faunin will be joined by a patient, Anthony Scarmack, tonight to share more about their experience in the study. Next, we have Dr. Keith McRae, who is a physician scientist and a member of the HHT team of specialists at Cleveland Clinic HHT Center of Excellence. Dr. McRae is the principal investigator for the pomalidomide clinical trial, better known as PATH-HHT study. Dr. McRae will also be joined by a patient, David Koss, to talk more about his experience with PATH. Next, we're excited to be joined by Dr. James Gossage, who is the director of the HHT Center of Excellence at Augusta University. Dr. Gossage is currently the principal investigator for the soon-to-launch pazopanib clinical trial. Last, but certainly not least, we have Brian Mangalog, who is a senior clinical project coordinator with the Rare Genomes Project, RGP, at the Broad Institute of MIT. RGP is a patient-driven research study led by genomics experts and clinicians who believe that the latest advancements in genomic sequencing are changing medicine and should be accessible to families with rare and undiagnosed conditions. At the end of our presentation, all panelists will be available to answer your questions, so please feel free to ask those as they come up. Now, let's begin our program. I will first turn things over to Cassie Friday to share an overview of clinical trials, and I now invite Cassie to turn on your camera, unmute yourself, and share your screen. While Cassie gets her slide up, we'll launch our first poll of the evening. Cassie, the floor is yours.
So, why clinical research is important in a broad sense is that it's all about finding treatments and cures for different diseases. And clinical trials are largely oriented to answer these two questions. Are these treatments safe and are these treatments effective? And clinical research is particularly important for the HHT community because there are currently no FDA-approved drugs for HHT. And this has major implications for insurance coverage of drugs and overall accessibility and equitability of care in HHT. There are many different types of clinical research studies. Some of them are as simple as donating tissue. So you can have saliva, blood cells donation, tissues from surgical removal of something. If you're going in to have surgery, typically those things that are taken out are usually thrown into the trash after they go to the pathology department. And they're not saved, but they could be donated for research, and that's really important. And then there are observational studies. These are typically longitudinal in nature, so they monitor you over a period of time, and there are usually no therapeutics tested in these types of studies. They're just trying to see how your symptoms may progress over time compared to others who don't have the same symptoms. And then there are clinical trials. And there are a lot of different parts to a clinical trial. And the first phase of a clinical trial is this preclinical phase that sometimes can last several years. And it usually starts in a laboratory working with cells or animal models of disease. And this is working to try to figure out the mechanism of how a disease works and what drugs and therapeutics we can use to target that disease in an actual clinical trial in human participants. And so then we begin in our phase 1 clinical trials, where we usually try to determine what dose of a therapeutic would be effective or would be the most safe. And then we can expand that a little bit into a phase 2 clinical trial with more participants, always monitoring the safety of the dosing that we're using, and then also trying to begin to see if this drug is effective in treating the symptoms it's intended to treat. And then sometimes this lasts for several months or years. And then you can expand to a phase 3 clinical trial, where maybe you're looking at a larger and more diverse cohort of research participants, continuing to monitor the safety, maybe looking at how effective the drug is for people with varying severity of disease. And then you can take all of that data together and you can pause and you can submit to the FDA for approval of your drug. And like I said, FDA approval is really critical for our therapeutics that we use. You may be receiving a drug to manage your HHT symptoms, but a lot of times that's a drug that's FDA approved for a different disease. So we want to get FDA approval for drugs specifically to treat HHT. So we have all of this data to back it up, to prove that it's safe and that it's effective. Because even after FDA approval, you still don't stop monitoring. You continue with clinical trials with more people, a more diverse population, in order to understand the long-term effectiveness of this therapeutic or device that you're trialing, and always continuing to monitor the safety of that product. And so you can do a lot of this research on your own through clinicaltrials.gov. Every clinical trial is registered there, and you can find more information by just typing in hereditary hemorrhagic telangiectasia. One of the studies that comes up is shown right here in this screenshot, and you can see information about the recruitment status of the clinical trial, whether it's finished, ongoing recruitment, or yet to be started, who's sponsoring the study, and who's funding it. You'll see a summary of what they're trying to achieve with the clinical trial, and then you'll also see information about the study design. So for example, this is an observational study, and it's a case control. So they're looking at people with certain symptoms or outcomes compared to people who don't have those same symptoms or outcomes, and trying to understand the driving factors of those differences. And you can see in this recruitment, it's a really long ongoing study that you'll hear more about in just a few minutes. Another study posted is an interventional clinical trial involving a therapeutic. This is randomized, so some people may get the drug and some people may get a placebo or an inactive kind of sugar replacement. And the thing is about these clinical trials is that they are masked in a way that you don't know if you're on the drug or the placebo. And this is really important. This type of masking leads us to have unbiased reviews of the data. So even the people who are prescribing you the drugs, your physician, the investigator, the people analyzing the data don't know who's in which group. Another HHT trial that you may find on clinicaltrials.gov also has the same study design scheme, but this has an extension option. So if you are on the placebo, you can complete the trial and then opt to extend your time, and you can actually be able to have the opportunity to take the actual therapeutic product. And that's really exciting. So the final question is why you should care, even if you may not directly benefit from participating in clinical research. And the first thing is that HHT is generational. So if it doesn't help you, it might help your family, your kids' kids. And this is really important to all of us. And if you're taking a placebo in a successful trial, just like the one I described, you may have the chance to take the treatment in the future through a crossover design or after the FDA approves it, which is really great. And the last reason is because we simply can't do it without you. There is no way that clinical research and approval for therapeutics can move forward without, the altruism of people who are willing to participate in clinical trials. So I will hand it over to our next presenter, and feel free to type any questions into the Q&A.
Thank you so much, Cassie. We really appreciate that overview of clinical trials. Next, please to turn things over to Dr. Fawnin to discuss the BVMC study. So Dr. Fawnin, please feel free to share your slides.
Thank you. One more second here and I'll have them up. Okay, thank you, Cassie, for that great intro. And I have to say, it's a real pleasure to be part of this really dynamic panel and to talk to you today about clinical research in HHT. My task is to talk to you specifically about the Brain Vascular Malformation Consortium, and it's a pleasure to do so. Okay, there we go. The Brain Vascular Malformation Consortium, or the BVMC, is a 15-year-long study. It's funded by NIH, NCAT, and NINDS, and is a truly international multi-center collaboration. It includes 17 centers from across the US, Canada, and the Netherlands, and also involves collaboration with Cure HHT. The consortium is actually structured with two other rare diseases with brain vascular malformations, and they're called Sturge-Weber and CCM, and we share resources and analyses, et cetera. So the idea here when we set up the Brain Vascular Malformation Consortium was to develop a truly powerful approach to solving this rare but severe problem of brain hemorrhage in HHT by bringing patients together from many centers and following them over many years. Brain AVM hemorrhage is a feared complication of brain AVMs, given that it can lead to disability and even sometimes death. Our primary goal in the BVMC is to try to understand why it is that some brain AVMs will one day lead to a hemorrhage, and others may exist quietly in the brain of an HHT patient for many years, or maybe even their entire lifetime without ever bleeding. We set out to try and understand, why does an AVM bleed? And we felt that there were probably both chronic factors and acute factors that are in play. And by these factors, what I mean are, in terms of chronic factors, are things like, how does an AVM develop and what's its structure? Like, how is it shaped? How big is it? Where is it located in the brain? Those sort of developmental factors, and also how development is influenced in early in life. Other factors might include environment, and I also mean to include the sort of biologic environment, or the medical sense of environment, meaning what's the environment that the AVM lives in that person with HHT? Do they have other diseases? Are there other lifestyle factors that affect the environment that the AVM is existing in? And then, of course, things like genetic factors, and not only HHT gene mutations, but other genetic makeup, and how those things affect the pathways that are really the pathways that determine our biology. And then we also presume that there are acute factors. Perhaps these are factors, unlike the chronic factors that may be there for a lifetime or for years or many months before an AVM bleeds, acute factors might be present the day an AVM bleeds or the days leading up to that. And those might be related to things like injury or inflammation, for example, and might include some of the same factors as the chronic factors as well. So one of the challenges when we're trying to measure or trying to detect these factors that would determine why an AVM bleeds is that AVM bleeds are an unpredictable and infrequent event. And so it's quite hard to try and measure the factors that were there right before an event happens if you don't know when it's going to happen, and it doesn't happen very often. And so because of this, we explicitly set out in the Brain Vascular Malformation Consortium, even though it's a brain study, we explicitly set out to also study nosebleeds in HHT. And the idea is that, since nosebleeds are a more chronic, well, first of all, occur from the same kind of lesion as brain AVM bleeds. So nosebleeds happen from AVMs in the nose or a smaller version of AVMs that we call telangiectasia. And nosebleeds happen chronically, frequently, often every day, or maybe even multiple times per day. And so this is obviously a much more plausible situation for us to, it was a much more plausible situation for us to go about and try and measure those factors. So again, we were interested in what are the factors that determine why the nose bleeds? And also, why the nose bleeds, but also we were interested in the factors that determine how severe nosebleeds are as well. And we felt that some of these factors, acute factors and chronic factors determining nosebleeds, are probably shared. They're probably similar to some of the factors that determine bleeding from brain AVMs. And so the model is really is very similar for how we're looking for acute and chronic factors that determine nosebleeds and also brain AVM bleeds. And we included one other aspect in the model as well, as what factors might actually determine why does an AVM develop in the first place in an HHT patient. Again, acute and chronic factors, all of interest, and some of these may be overlapping between development and leading to bleeding of brain AVMs and leading to bleeding from the nose. So ultimately, we set out to study all these types of factors in the BVMC, and you can see actually I've circled what, these are all BVMC study questions, looking for the acute factors and the chronic factors in the nosebleeds and the brain AVMs. And we did so by collecting a number of different kinds of samples. And Cassie did a good intro of talking about the utility of some of these samples, so I won't go into too much detail, but specifically in the BVMC, just to say that we collect blood and saliva. We collect to help us determine genetic factors and pathway factors and measures of inflammation and injury, et cetera. We're also collecting brain imaging so that we can actually describe the structure, shape, size, and other features of the AVMs, as those may be factors as well. We collect nosebleed scores, and we collect other information like a person's medical history and their lifestyle history that contribute to our understanding of the environment. We ultimately do all of this so that one day we can turn those factors into targets. And what I mean by targets is targets for therapy. And so we are doing so with the hopes of developing targets for therapy for nosebleeds, but also for brain hemorrhage eventually. Thankfully, there are a number of different groups working on studying these factors, identifying the factors, identifying targets, because this is a big job that we have to do in HHT, but progress has been moving rapidly forward, and we now have a number of targets that have been identified from our group and from other groups, and that are turning into opportunities for clinical trials. We in fact have a small clinical trial, a targeted therapy that's part of the BVMC. It's a pilot project that's funded through the BVMC, like as part of the BVMC by the NIH. And this is an early phase. And thank you again, Cassie, for explaining the different phases of the trial, because this is exactly, this is a very early phase clinical trial, a small trial to treat nosebleeds in HHT. And it's of a drug called sirolimus. It's a tablet. And the idea is that it's targeting a pathway that's been shown to be abnormal in HHT. And the goals of this trial are really to see whether we can detect a signal that the drug might work, and whether there's any evidence, and to gain some evidence about the safety of the drug in HHT patients. The bottom line, though, is in 2023, we need many more clinical trials. We need some early trials and then advanced clinical trials, because we have a number of newly identified targets for therapies, and I think there are more coming down the road. Many of the trials will first be done for epistaxis for all the reasons we've talked about today, but they will eventually, hopefully, lead to therapies that we can study for brain AVM, GI, liver, etc. I want to close by saying that if we want to get to effective therapies for HHT, I believe the most important thing is collaboration, because there is power in numbers, as we've talked about today. There's relevance when scientists and patients work together. We know we're working on the relevant questions. There's speedy progress when we share findings and collaborate across internationally. Finally, I want to say thank you to the people that are making this happen, who are making who are really advancing the cause of finding therapies in HHT. And that includes people with HHT participating in research, Cure HHT, scientists, funders, collaborators. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Funnen, for your presentation. Important stuff, and it certainly takes all of us. Before I turn things over, also want to remind the participants who may just be joining us to please feel free to use the Q&A field. We will be answering questions at the end of all the presentations, so please feel free to ask your questions there. Now it is my privilege to turn things over to a BVMC participant, Anthony Skarmak, who has kindly joined us for tonight's webinar. Anthony, if you could unmute yourself and turn your camera on, the floor is yours.
Hello, everyone. My name again is Anthony Skarmak. I am someone who lives with HHT and I'm part of the BVMC test. A little background about myself. I'm originally from Northeast Ohio, but currently I am located in Phoenix, Arizona, as I go to Arizona State University, and my major is journalism. And then a little bit of background about HHT for me is I first found that I had HHT. My mom had HHT, well, has HHT. My grandpa as well. It's just been run down as the family. And so when I got tested when I was about 7 years old back in 2012, and they originally found an 8-centimeter AVM malformation in my brain. And while at the time we were looking around for places to best get that surgery and that sort of thing, we found that the best place to go was St. Louis Children's Hospital in Missouri, as long as it was also with St. Bernardus Jewish Hospital. And we had the surgery done with the coils and glue with the 8-centimeter, and it went well. And then I went back in the summertime and they found another AVM behind it. And they got that one done with Gamma Knife. And then after that, a few years passed and I was just checking up with them. And by that point, I went through puberty again, and they found a couple more. In me, and I had more coil and glue done, 2 more. And then in June of 2016, was when I had my final checkup, and everything was good. And then just this last summer, I got tested. I got my brain tested again, as well as my lungs for a CT scan. And I got a CT scan, and it came back with AVM malformation that was about 4 millimeters big. And I just got that done at the Cleveland Clinic just back in December of 2022. Everything went smoothly and great and all that good stuff. But a big thing that I wanted to talk about was I am so happy to be a part of this study, because I've lived with HHT my entire life, and I've watched it progress with the way that modern technology is going, and the way that everything we are learning more and new stuff about it every day and learning how to treat it better. And I'm so thankful for that. And so I want to give as much as I can to help that further. And that is why, as a big reason why I'm a part of this study. I would just like to thank all my panelists and everyone for having me on today. And I will be here for the Q&A. So if anyone does have any questions for me, you just want to put that into the Q&A. So I just want to say thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Anthony. We really appreciate you sharing your story and your experience. Next, we'll be hearing more about the PASS study from Dr. McCrae. Dr. McCrae, please feel free to launch your slides, turn on your camera, and unmute yourself.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Riley. Can everybody see my slides okay, I guess? Thanks. Thank you for the opportunity to be here. Thank you to all the other panelists for sharing the interesting work everybody's doing. And most of all, thank you for the patients for participating in trials and for being here tonight. I have a fairly streamlined slide set that will tell you a little bit about the pomalidomide trial. We call this PATH HHT, as Riley mentioned. I'm just going to tell you a little bit about what thalidomide is and what we think it does, because I'm often asked, well, how does this work? And this is a study that was published actually more than 10 years ago in Nature Medicine. And they took patients, they had about 10 patients, they treated them with thalidomide. Now, thalidomide is related to pomalidomide. I call pomalidomide a third generation thalidomide, if you will. It's been engineered a little bit to remodeled. It seems to have less toxicity, but some similar efficacy effects. But in any case, this study treated patients, and in some patients they basically did nose biopsies of the inside of the nose. All these patients had nosebleeds, and they biopsied their nose before and after treatment in several patients. And what you find in HHT before treatment is that the blood vessel linings, they call this the endothelium, is quite thin. And for a blood vessel to properly form, it's important for the endothelium to connect with all the cells underneath the endothelium in the wall of the blood vessel. And these are smooth muscle cells, and there's several other different cell types. But what these other cells do is reinforce the blood vessel so it's stable and it doesn't burst and leak. And so if you look down at the bottom here, you see, for example, in subject 8, before treatment, a patient, with normal HHT vessels that are thin, kind of tortuous, as you can see there. And this occurs to varying degrees, as you can see in patients 8 and 9. Now, subject 10 was a patient who had his biopsy after being treated with thalidomide. And you can see how thick, these are, again, blood vessels, the thick green structures, but you can see how much thicker they are than in the other subjects. And so really, it seemed, at least in this study, that the mechanism of thalidomide was thought to be helping the interior lining of the blood vessel to talk better with the supporting structures of the blood vessel, and therefore build a more stable blood vessel. It's not just blocking new vessel formation, it's making the vessels that are there more stable and more resistance from bleeding. Now this is, and I will say, before we started this study, I did a small study. It basically, based on what Cassie said, we would call this a phase 1/2 study, our original study. I'm not going to show that, but we had about 9 patients in there, and we had, more than half the patients had some very nice responses. We had one patient who was getting intravenous iron literally weekly, to getting it only about 3 or 4 times a year when they were on study. What initially got me interested in this in the first place was, before any studies, I had a patient come to me who had von Willebrand disease, a bleeding disorder, as well as bad HHT. He was requiring blood factors multiple times a week. His bill for just blood factors were about $40,000 a week, and he was told that he would need to have most of his intestine removed, but I actually put him on thalidomide, and within 2 or 3 weeks, his bleeding had entirely stopped. So I said, this is something we need to study more. Thalidomide is something that's kind of a little bit passé. It's not studied much anymore, but Celgene was kind enough to offer me pomalidomide. In any case, this is our study sites, as you can see here. And we are trying to cross the country as much as we can. Cleveland Clinic is the central clinical coordinating center. Research Triangle Institute, shown down in North Carolina, is the primary data coordinating center. We're just about to open University of Minnesota. We have the Mayo Clinic involved, University of Utah, UCSF, a whole number of places, University of Penn, Mass General. Our goal is to get 159 patients. That's our target. And this is where we sit as of January 18. We've randomized 127. As I mentioned, we need to randomize 159 to meet our study goals. Now, to be eligible for this study, you need to have a clinical diagnosis of HHT. And I won't read all of these to you. You need to be over 18-year-olds, etc. And this is the main requirement here down at number 6 and 7. You need to have an epistaxis severity score equal to or greater than 3 over the preceding 3 months, which is moderate on nosebleeds. And you have to have anemia and or parenteral, that means intravenous infusion of at least 250 milligrams of iron or transfusion of 1 unit of blood over the 24 weeks preceding the screening visit. So if you read that closely, you actually don't have to be anemic to be in our study, but you need to have an iron requirement. And we've actually made some adjustments to, if you are one of the very few HHT patients who responds adequately on oral iron, we can try to get you into the study as well. Now, this is the design of the study. We first see patients for a screening visit. We take their history, we measure their epistaxis severity, and we do some laboratory studies. If it looks like they're eligible, sometime in the next 4 weeks, we randomize them for their bleeding over the last 4 weeks. We do a little bit more testing. We actually do genetic testing, or at least we ask patients to get genetic testing. If they've already had it, that's great. We do have funding in our study to pay for genetic testing if patients haven't had it, because at the end of the day, with all these new treatments emerging, I think it's going to be very important to see if any particular genetic changes predict a response to one drug or another. We then randomize them to pomalidomide or placebo. They undergo 6 4-week treatment courses. They have a study visit at the end of each month, and I'll talk about that in a minute. There's several things we measure at each visit. And every 3 months, we do a quality of life score, and we do a phone app to basically measure their total bleeding duration. After the end of the study, we follow them for another 4 weeks to just see how they're doing. So as Cassie mentioned, this would be a phase 3 randomized study. It's a quadruple blinded study. So neither the investigators, myself, the research nurses know what drug the patient is getting. The patient doesn't know which drug they're getting, and the analysts don't know what drug they're getting. This is what we call the schedule of events. This is what we do at each visit. Now, one thing I would like to point out, that these are all the monthly visits. Only the ones in white are the ones where you actually have to come see us. Actually, thanks to COVID, or in spite of COVID, we wanted to keep this study going, so we changed all these other visits to virtual visits. So these can be done by phone or Zoom conference, and we can collect. It will require a blood draw at a local lab, but you don't have to come see us, and it makes it a lot easier to participate. We do get research bloods at the baseline and at the end of treatment, because again, I think that we'll be able to look at changes in biomarkers, in RNA in the blood, to try to see if there's any particular things that change that correlate with clinical improvement. This may not only give us information as to how pomalidomide works, but it maybe expose us or provide us with new targets for treatment, as Marie mentioned. This just shows an example of our epistaxis duration phone application app. If any of you have used the Cure HHT app, you'll see that the symbols, some of the symbols are quite similar. Cure HHT was nice enough to allow those to use that, though the app itself is different. This is set up by the study coordinator. They can help the patient download the app and give them the code, And then over the particular periods when we measure this, whenever the participant has a nosebleed, they just enter in how long the nosebleed lasts. And that data is automatically and securely transmitted to the data coordinating center that records it and summarizes it. Now, what are the endpoints we're looking at? The major endpoint is nose bleeding. We're looking for the change of the epistaxis severity score from the baseline to week 24. We chose nose bleeding because we need something that's really easy to measure. And you can argue how easy it is to measure, but it's a lot easier than other types of bleeding. And so it's a nice, clean endpoint. Now we are collecting a whole lot of other information, the amount of iron administered, the amount of red blood cells, change in quality of life scores, a number of scoring systems to look at quality of life. We actually developed our own HHT specific quality of life score, which we're further testing here. And as I mentioned earlier, using the phone app or just paper records if you don't like smartphones, we're measuring the weekly duration of nosebleeds. This is our current accrual, the blue line, and we're funded mostly by the National Institute of Health here. So it's a very, very rigorous, very closely monitored study that we all monitor very closely for safety as well as efficacy. This is what was projected and what is expected of us. As you can see in the green line, we're a little bit behind here. We got delayed, particularly in the beginning, because right in the beginning of the COVID pandemic, we've done pretty well. We've fallen off a little bit lately, though I think we're starting to pick up, but we really only need about 29 or 30 more patients to finish this study. It'll be by far the largest HHT clinical trial ever done. We really would appreciate getting some more patients into this study so we can wrap it up. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the investigators are blinded to the treatment arm. So if you ask me, are there responders? I'm not supposed to know. I can tell you that I've had my own patients on this, and you'll hear from one of them shortly, David Koss, about his experience. But I think it's fair to say that most of the investigators believe that there's definite responders. Some responses have seemed to have been dramatic. Certainly in my phase 1 trial, there were. Interestingly, and David may speak to this a little bit, but we found that some responders, even after stopping the drug, can remain in a complete remission for many months afterwards, drug-free. And as Cassie mentioned, in our study, patients who respond or who we think were on placebo or didn't, we are able to, Celgene has actually been bought by another company, Bristol Myers Squibb, who was still very interested in this study, and they agreed to provide drug to patients who want to continue off-label after the end of the study. It does take a little bit of negotiation. You have to be refused by insurance first, but once that happens, they've been quite good. We found the side effects have been relatively minor and quite manageable. And the other point I'd like to make is, though we're treating patients with a certain dose of pomalidomide, I don't know if this is the right dose. I suspect it's maybe even more than we need. And if we're able to get this study over the borderline and ultimately this drug gets approved for HHT, it's likely that much lower doses may be even better tolerated and used at the physician's discretion. In some patients, particularly David may speak to this, I've put him on a lower regimen than what he was on during the study. So I would, again, that's all of my slides, but I would like to again thank all of you for being on the study and thank Cure HHT, not only for their support of this study, but for all the work they do to treat this disease. And it's really been a pleasure to work in partnership with Cure HHT on this.
Thank you for the kind words, Dr. McRae, and for sharing that important information. We're now going to turn things over to PATH participant and patient David Koss. David, thanks for being with us, and the floor is yours.
Great, thank you very much. And I want to thank Dr. McCrae so much because he is responsible for basically giving my life back with this study that I've been a part of. I just want to go into a little bit about my history. Probably like everyone that is watching this, they have suffered with HHT and the nosebleeds that go with it. And those can dominate your life, and it becomes something that ruins your personal relationships. It could ruin your professional life. It can wear you down. Just the energy that it draws from you. We can no longer wear white. Swimming is a really big risk, trying to go under the water. Those are small things, but it really is a serious health issue that I've had to deal with for my entire life. My grandfather suffered from HHT. My mother suffered from HHT. My brother suffers from HHT. And because of this study, I can say that I may still have HHT, but I no longer suffer from it. And I will talk a little bit about that. But 25 years ago, my nosebleed started to get much more progressive. And that was when I first sought out an ENT about this. And nobody had ever heard the term HHT at that time. At least I never did. And my ENT didn't, because he recommended to me to pinch my nose and tilt my head back when I get a nosebleed. That's where I started from seeking treatment more than 2 decades ago. I had numerous cauterizations. I had numerous surgeries that took place. I was given creams. I was given sprays. Nothing worked. It wasn't until I finally bottomed out a couple of years ago, and I had a 5-hour plus nosebleed, heavy nosebleed, that I had to go to the emergency room, where I was very close to getting a blood transfusion because I had lost so much blood, that I finally hit rock bottom. And that was when my oncologist got me started on the iron treatments, and I began a regimen of receiving iron transfusions to boost my hemoglobin, which had fallen into the single digits at that time. And that was a shock to me, because I was always a very active person. I was an active distance runner, and now I couldn't climb a flight of steps without being completely out of breath and completely unable to manage. So I couldn't do anything physically. I was so worn down. So with the oncologist, he recommended to me that I contact the Cleveland Clinic and Dr. Paramble, who is a doctor there who handles HHT patients. And it was through Dr. Paramble that he recommended to me Dr. McCrae in this study, and stated that they were looking for people to do this study for HHT. And sign me up. Anything could be better than the hell that I was living through, and that I had to put other people through as well too, because they were, also suffering from it, seeing me suffer at the worst times that there were. So it was through Dr. McCrae that I got into the study, and I can tell you, it's life-changing. If you would have told me that not a cream, not a spray, not a surgery, not a cauterization, not all of these things that directly deal with the nose would work, but a pill would work, I would have said you were crazy. And that's exactly what happened. I can tell you that I was not on the placebo, because within just a couple of days, I felt the very minor side effects of the drug that I was taking, which was a itchy forehead or itchy head, skin, a little bit of a rash, but that went away within a few days. But I did notice that the bleeding almost stopped completely, just within a couple of days. And it stayed that way for the 6 months that I was on the study. At the conclusion of the 6 months, when I came off of it, the bleeding picked up a little bit, but the intensity, the duration, the amount of nosebleeds, the number of them was completely decreased. It was night and day. It really was. It came back a little, but not a lot. And even 6+ months after I was on it, I still was nowhere near to what I was before the study. As Dr. McCrae stated, I am now back onto the drug that I was taking during it. He was able to obtain that for me through working with compassionate use directly with the drug maker. And again, my nosebleeds are almost non-existent. Not a cure, but it is so minor compared to what it was. And I can tell people out there, anybody that suffers from HHT, from the anxiety, the draining of your iron that just saps your energy and your mood and those around you and everyone that has to deal with that. This is something that worked for me. And I can't say that it's going to work for everybody the same way, but it worked for me and I was bad. I had it very, very badly. And it worked. So I would encourage people to please contact Dr. McCray, contact HHT, and look into these studies, because truly the only way we're ever going to get ourselves out of this and our next generations and everyone else is if we take this step and establish these treatments and cures. My life has been given back to me, and this has truly been life-changing. And I'd be happy to answer any questions that anybody has about my experiences during the trial during the Q&A session. Thank you.
Well said, David. Thank you so much for sharing your experience. It truly makes a difference. Next up, we have Dr. Jim Gossage to discuss the PAS study. Dr. Gossage, please proceed with your presentation.
Thank you, Riley. I first wanted to just really congratulate Dr. Fawnin and McCray for their really excellent studies and thank all the patients that have enrolled in them so far. So I'll be talking about pazopanib. We don't have a fancy name for our study yet, but we'll try to come up with one. And I can see we're a little bit behind time, so I'll try to skip a couple slides and see if we can leave as much time as possible for questions from the audience at the end. So I wanted to point out that the study sponsor for this randomized study is Cure HHT through the Department of Defense, and that this presentation has been approved by the overall central IRB for this study. And they made several recommendations for the slides, and I complied with those.
Dr. Gossage, we're not seeing your screen just yet.
Sorry about that. Forgot to do one thing, share the screen. So what is pazopanib? This is an oral medication that is currently FDA approved for the treatment of certain types of cancers. For the current study that we're talking about, it's an experimental drug that will be given at about 1/5 of the cancer dose. So we're hopeful that that will be associated with fewer side effects. Its mechanism of action involves an inhibition of certain proteins and enzymes called tyrosine kinases, including VEGF or vascular endothelial growth factor, all of which are believed to be involved in the development of AVMs in HHT. So we hope that by the inhibition of these proteins and enzymes, that we can prevent AVM development and perhaps even cause them to shrink. There have been several studies that have gone on prior to this randomized study. The first one was published by Dr. Fawnin and colleagues in 2019 and looked at a dose of pazopanib, 50 milligrams, so a very small dose, about 1/16 of the cancer dose. And this was a prospective study of pazopanib in 7 patients who had HHT-related bleeding. All 7 patients showed either improvement in their nosebleeds and or their anemia. Then in 2020, Dr. Bramble from Cleveland Clinic and colleagues published a retrospective study of pazopanib, 25 to 300 milligrams, on average about 150 milligrams. This was in 13 patients who needed transfusion for HHT-related bleeding. So this was a much more severe group than the group studied by Fawnin. And all 13 patients showed really a marked improvement in epistaxis, hemoglobin, and RBC transfusions. Essentially, hemoglobin went up by about 4 grams, 4 points, and RBC transfusions essentially went down to 0 in almost everybody. Really a dramatic response and one of the key studies in helping to promote the current randomized study. I'm going to skip this study here. So the study that we're talking about, that I'm presenting today, the basic design is, again, this is an experimental use of this drug, pazopanib. It'll start with a 6 to 12-week run-in period to assess the baseline severity. So we want to make sure that we really have a good understanding of how bad nosebleeds are before we actually give patients drug. Then it'll be followed by a 24-week randomized study of pazopanib, 150 milligrams daily versus placebo. So half the patients will get pazopanib, half will get placebo. Neither the doctor nor the patient will know what they're getting, at least in the beginning. At the end of that 24-week period, all patients will have an option to roll over to a 24-week study where everybody gets pazopanib. Even if you got placebo during the first half of the study, you'll get active drug pazopanib during the second half of the study. How will we define the success of the study drug? And Dr. McCrae talked about this a little bit, the so-called primary endpoint. This is what the study result really rests on. And our plan is to compare the number of pazopanib and placebo patients who either show a 2-point increase in hemoglobin at weeks 19 through 24 compared to the baseline result that we determined during that running period, or if they show a 50% decrease in the duration of nose bleeding at weeks 19 through 24 compared to baseline. So for example, if you started out with a hemoglobin of, let's say 9, and you went up to 12, that'd be a 3-point increase. So that would qualify, and we would consider that that patient had shown an improvement. And basically, we'll look and look to see if there was a statistically significant difference in the number of patients getting pazopanib versus placebo who showed one of these two benefits. And if there is, then we will consider the study a success. You can join this study. These are the so-called inclusion criteria. And I just listed some of the main ones here. And I'm sure Nicole will show a link to clinicaltrials.gov where you can look at the full list of inclusion and exclusion criteria. But basically, you've got to be between age 18 and 80. You have to have definite or probable diagnosis of HHT. Have to have nosebleeds of at least 20 minutes per week and an average hemoglobin of less than 11. So you have to have nosebleeds and you have to have anemia. You can also have gastrointestinal bleeding, and that could even be the more severe problem, as long as you have this modest amount of nose bleeding. An important factor is you have to have the ability to complete the daily blood pressure and nosebleed monitoring apps that we will provide. Very similar app to what Dr. McCrae showed for the nosebleed, not exactly the same, but a similar concept. Another key factor is you have to be willing to forego other treatments such as laser. So if you're thinking that, well, if this study doesn't help me in 4 weeks, I'll go get a laser. Well, you would have to drop out of the study for that to happen. And essentially that would deny some other patient of being in the study. So really you've got to be committed for the duration of the study that as long as things don't get any worse, you're in it for the long haul. Women of childbearing potential must use birth control. Then we have a list of exclusion criteria, in other words, things that you aren't allowed to join the study if you have these. Poorly controlled high blood pressure is one of them. You can have high blood pressure, but as long as it's under control, that's okay. There's the continued use of certain medications like simvastatin or VEGF inhibitors like Avastin in the past 4 to 6 weeks. It's okay if you've had those in the past, even recently, as long as you're off of them when the study starts. And we have other things like incompletely treated lung or brain AVM, malignancy, worse than skin cancer in the last 5 years, planned surgery during the study. So if you're thinking you might need to have your hip replaced, you would need to forego this study because this medicine can delay healing. So what's expected of patients? Sorry, I don't have a very nice, pretty slide like Dr. McCrae had. I'll have to borrow something like that from him. It was very nice. But very similar to his study, we have 2 in-person visits at the start and at week 24. In between, we have virtual visits every 3 weeks, and there'd be a total of 22 over the combined randomized study and extension study. Got to take the study drug every day. It's once a day. Have to record your blood pressure and nosebleeds every day. There's electronic questionnaires to be filled out every 3 weeks. Blood and urine tests at a local lab every 3 weeks. and a finger electrocardiogram like you see on the TV commercials every 6 weeks. Will the study cost me anything? So the study drug and all these lab tests will be provided for free. We do provide some reimbursement for travel expenses based on how far you travel. Blood pressure cuff and EKG devices are provided for free. So basically nothing or not much for most patients. What are the most common risks of pazopanib? Increased blood pressure is one of them. In general, this can be treated with oral medications. And if we can treat you and get it lowered, you can stay in the study. Increased liver enzymes in the blood is one of the side effects. As seen in about 20% of patients at the cancer dose, we expect that to be lower for this study, but we don't know for sure. Other side effects include changes to heart rhythm, infections, gastrointestinal symptoms like diarrhea, low energy, and protein in the urine. So far in the studies we've done that we've talked about, the side effects have been fairly low level. Enrollment is expected to begin in March of 2023. We have at least 12 US sites that will be enrolling, really going from the Northeast to the South, a little bit of the Midwest, and then the West. And that's all I have, and I'll also be happy to answer questions at the end.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gossage. As Dr. Gossage said, if you have any questions about pazopanib or any of the other trials you've heard about, please do use the Q&A portion. It's great to see that so active. Our final speaker of the night will be Brian Manglong to talk more about the Rare Genomes Project. While Brian is getting his presentation set up, we'll launch our third and final poll of the night. Brian, the floor is yours.
Hi, everyone. Thank you. Just echoing the thank yous to Cure HHT for organizing this, and of course to the community for participating in research and your interest in research. So I'm here. I'm a senior coordinator with the Rare Genomes Project, located at the Broad Institute of MIT and Harvard in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And we are a research study doing genomic sequencing for families with rare disease in general, but we're happy to work with Cure HHT and the HHT community to bring our study and our testing to you. Just as a quick background to where I'm coming from, I'm just one of a larger group at the Broad Institute made up of clinicians, analysts, engineers, all working together, dedicated to improving rare disease diagnosis. We are working in a wide variety of fields just to see if we can improve rare disease diagnosis for the greater good. And so just to lay out the groundwork for our study, do just want to talk a little bit about genetic testing, which has been brought up a couple of times through the other studies. So just first of all, to mention, there are a couple of types of genetic sequencing. The first that I'll mention is targeted sequencing. These really are the ones you probably have heard of through companies like Invitae or GeneDx. There are many panels out there that are targeting those specific genes that are known and related to HHT. Then there's a step up of genetic testing that you may have seen, which is whole exome sequencing that looks at all of the coding regions of our genes and our DNA to really see if there is any changes that might be related to the symptoms. But one thing to know is that the exome, in the grand scheme of things, is fairly small. It's only 1 to 2% of the entirety of your genome. And then what we're doing with our study is we are implementing whole genome sequencing. So this is looking at both the coding and non-coding regions of the DNA. I will mention that targeted sequencing and a lot of panels do include some of the surrounding non-coding regions of these HHT-specific genes. But again, with whole genome sequencing, it allows us to look for any changes in the DNA that could explain the symptoms that are going on. And so with that groundwork, I will a little mention of why our study and participating genetic testing is important. Kind of like I mentioned with the whole genome sequencing, we are able to do a little bit more that can be done than the traditional testing that can be found clinically at the moment. Just identifying a genetic cause of HHT in families is, as we all know, is very important. And it's just possible by doing whole genome sequencing that we find genetic causes that may be outside of those known HHT genes, or we find something that just is a little bit different than what's been seen before. Receiving a genetic diagnosis also allows for patients and families for testing, to get testing for at-risk family members. If someone gets a genetic diagnosis through us, we are definitely happy to direct you to those centers of excellence, to Cure HHT, and also imagine a world where there are gene-specific clinical trials or gene-specific treatments. So having that knowledge will just help there. Knowing your genetic diagnosis will also allow us and you to contribute to just general databases, patient registries, and creating this data does just create more for other researchers to work on so that this work may continue. And just quickly, just to go over some overall goals with our study, we really launched this to increase access to genomic sequencing. Our study is done free of cost and is done remotely. So we just want to bridge or take down any barriers that comes with genetic testing. Overall, we really focus on identifying genetic causes of single gene disorders. HHT definitely falls within that scope, but we're really focused on conditions that can be traced back to a single gene. As I also mentioned, we do share information in our data very broadly, just to help drive rare disease research and keep all of this work going. And then ultimately, the goal of this study is to return results to families in partnership with their local provider so that they can take it and add it to their medical care and provide any additional resources, whether that is research, treatment, or anything else there. And so in terms of eligibility criteria for our study, kind of been mentioned a couple of these things already, but participants must have or be a family member of a person with a suspected monogenic condition, that is single gene disorder. We are limited to the United States at this time, and having a medical provider who is involved in their care is important as well, just because due to the remote nature of the study, we do rely on the local clinician to provide us with medical information, and then again on the back end to hand off a result too. Specific to this community, some eligibility criteria for us are, of course, having a suspected, at least suspected diagnosis of HHT. We are also really focused on enrolling families that either cannot get clinical genetic testing or have had prior testing be negative. We do recognize that clinical genetic testing is available and definitely encourage people to go through that before they reach out to us. And then also we ask that participants do not have a familial variant identified. If you are looking for carrier testing, we're not the appropriate study, but we're happy to direct you to other resources. Again, we're really focused on finding a genetic diagnosis for a family where one has just not been found yet. And so just what it looks like for families is that you can either start an application online or get in contact with us by phone, and we can go through the application that way. We're just asking questions about the symptoms, the history, family history, any previous testing. like I've been mentioning, no prior genetic testing is required, but we do encourage getting clinical testing if available. That will 100% of the time be faster than our testing. Again, a panel is just looking at a smaller range than we are, so that will always be faster if that's really what you're concerned about. But feel free to come to us if that is not accessible to you. After reviewing the application, we do invite, of course, any affected individuals, biological parents, if they are available, and any other affected relatives to enroll in the study. We do collect blood samples. Again, that's done locally, so we will help you out with that. I can go through that when folks are enrolled. And then comes back to us for the whole genome sequencing. And at the same time, we collect medical records on all of those that are symptomatic in the family to add to our analysis. And then finally, on the back end of things, if we do have a result, we work with the local providers to actually get that result to you and provide some further guidance. Should mention, as I've kind of been mentioning this whole time, is that our study, again, will take longer than clinical testing, and it's different for everybody that does get involved. It's possible that this takes a year, years plural, but we are working to make sure we have certain results for everybody, that we do have something to return to. And so just thank you again for listening. And if you are interested in checking out the study, feel free to check out our website or contact us, and I'm happy to answer any questions as well.
Thank you, Brian. And thank you to all of our speakers for a thorough overview of your respective areas and trials. We hope our viewers found this information beneficial, and will now begin the Q&A portion of our event. So I'd like to invite all of our panelists to please turn on your cameras and unmute yourselves if you would. We did have a lot of great information to cover tonight, so we are running a bit over time, but hopefully some of our speakers and participants alike can hang around for just a bit longer. While we're sifting through all of the great questions that have been sent in the Q&A portion of Skype, I wanted to pose this question for our panel. In our poll asking what would make you most hesitant to participate in research, safety was listed as the #1 concern. Is there anything anybody from this group would like to share to address safety as a concern or hesitation to participating in clinical research?
Well, I'm happy to start. Others can kick in, but all these trials are very closely monitored. I mean, ours is funded by National Institute of Health, and we have a data safety monitoring board, and one of the members is Marie, and they review us completely. They review every case of any kind of toxicity about every 3 to 4 months, and they get all this data, and we meet with them, and they ask us questions, and this is a regular process to ensure safety. We also have a process where if anyone was to get a severe side effect, we have an independent medical monitor who reviews this independently within a day of the occurrence, and we all factor this in. So anytime you're federally funded, and we're federally funded by NIH, I know that Jim is federally funded by DOD. All of these agencies require us to use the utmost of safety, and safety always comes first in all of these studies. I understand, patients are always worried about being a quote guinea pig, but it's not like that. I mean, for example, the drug we use and the drug Jim uses have both been used as cancer drugs. I mean, ours has been used in thousands and thousands and thousands of patients. Jim's probably as well. So we know a lot about these drugs. It's not like we're pulling something completely new off the shelf that's never been put in people before. It's monitored very closely. I understand that concern for sure, but I think all of us would say that it's always safety first.
Yeah, I would echo what Keith says. There is an exhausting number of hoops we have to jump through with the Department of Defense, the IRB, the federal government, everybody really all focused on safety. And like Keith said, safety is first. If we start one of these trials and something terrible happens, that trial's done, which could mean that drug is done. So we really emphasize safety first, lowest possible dose, really close monitoring. So even if a side effect does happen, we can nip it in the bud before it becomes a severe side effect. Treat it, stop the medicine. I did want to make one other comment, just kind of along the area of research, and Cassie did a very nice introduction at the beginning of why should we do research? And I've heard a number of patients over the years say, yeah, I'm all for research. I just don't want to be that person to do it, or I'm afraid I'm going to get a placebo. The problem, and I understand that, but the problem with that way of thinking about it is if everybody thinks that way and everybody else is just like you, we'll never do research. So we just got to step up and get it done to help yourselves and your families in the long run.
Thank you for that, Dr. McRae and Dr. Gossage. Hopefully that provides some extra information this group was looking for. Dr. Fon, I don't know if you had a point to add to that, but I have a question for you from the group as well. This comes from Geraldine. I hope I'm pronouncing that okay. But the question is, would it potentially be too dangerous to wait to see if a drug works for a brain AVM?
Yeah, first of all, I think Dr. McRae and Dr. Gossage answered the other question, really extensively, and I completely agree with what they said. To Geraldine's question, which is a great question, I would answer, yes, and we're not quite ready to do that yet. Like, we wouldn't do that today, right? The idea is that we might work towards that, and there are a number of things that we would have to figure out before we were giving a drug like some of the ones you've heard today to try and treat a brain AVM. We might be looking instead, for example, for a drug that works faster, or a drug that's injected directly into an AVM, so that we were looking for a rapid response. It may not be the same kind of therapy, I guess is what I mean, or the way that we give it as we do for nosebleeds. And then the other thing is that, one of the things that I could add about the question of safety for trials in general is that we're very careful about how we select the patients for a clinical trial, especially the first trials that we do with a particular treatment or in a particular disease or problem. So we always start with the people who we think are most likely to tolerate the drug and that would have, lowest risk. So no one would head out on a clinical trial of brain AVMs with, right off the bat without doing those kind of earlier trials where we would say, okay, what are the types of AVMs that would be lowest risk to treat with a drug, and how would we want to treat with that drug, and how would we design the trial to keep it safe? So really great question. And it certainly, it requires a lot of work for us to be in the right place, but it doesn't mean that we won't get there one day.
Thank you so much, Dr. Fon. This next question comes from Diana. It is posed to Dr. McRae, specifically related to pomalidomide, but other panelists can certainly jump here too. The question asks, are we looking at if pomalidomide is effective on GI or liver AVMs?
Yeah, that is a really great question. I think, as I mentioned, we selected nosebleeds because honestly, when you're trying to get a grant funded to do research, you have to have something you can easily measure. You can convince the reviewers you can really show a difference. And, hopefully, if this drug works in the nose, it will work elsewhere. And we hope the same for other drugs as well. So in our study, and I think in Jim's study too, he can comment, but we certainly don't exclude people who have AVMs in other organs. And we do follow those, and we do hope that they do respond, but our study is not, there's something called powering, where you have to have a certain amount of responses to show a statistically meaningful difference at the end of the study. Those other types of bleedings are less common in HHT, And our studies are not necessarily powered to tell us whether they work or not, but in those other areas. I think it's interesting in HHT. We always think of an AVM as an AVM, but I don't think that's the case. I know that, blood vessels are different in every organ. And it's likely that some of these drugs will work in some, maybe not as well in other organs, but long story short, those things do not preclude you from being in our study. We do follow them, but you would still have to have the nosebleed to get in.
Thank you, Dr. McRae. Next, we're seeing a lot of questions related to Avastin. One Mary asked, and I'm going to try to generalize a few questions into one, are curious about assessing treatments and what is the potential benefit of having multiple treatment options and which one might be right for certain patients. I don't know who wants to jump in first there.
I can try and answer that if I understand it correctly, meaning that we want to have multiple different therapies available for people with HHT. I think that's absolutely the case and will be super important, because I think we're going to learn, as we are learning in other diseases, that certain people might react well to one drug, better to one drug than another. And some of that might be genetically determined or determined by other things about their health. And so, we want, for example, an easy example might be some people it may turn out that some therapies work really well for people with an endoglin mutation, and other therapies work better for people with an ACVRL1 mutation. So we'll want to have those options. We don't want to have just one drug that only works for half of the people with HHT. And it may also be that over time, a drug works for a few years and that then patients need to move on to a different drug. I mean, that's certainly the case in a lot of other diseases. And so that's another reason why we need multiple options. And then I think finally, some people, there's a range of disease, of severity in HHT. And so there may be some drugs that are appropriate for people with really severe disease, but the people with really mild disease may not want something that requires IV infusions or has a significant risk associated with the treatment, so that we want to be able to adjust the therapy to the severity of disease too.
Thank you, Dr.
I hope that answered the question.
It certainly did. Thank you for that.
Okay.
The next question from the group here is asking if there is any research showing the effects of holistic variables, for example, behaviors, food intake or sensitivities, sleep patterns, water consumption, exercise, that show a positive effect on HHT.
So I'll start with this one. That's a really great question. And this is something that we get a lot. A lot of HHT patients will find that sometimes the environment in which they live or that they travel to can aggravate their symptoms or their nosebleeds. Sometimes the foods that they consume can make a difference in their bleeding habits. And this is something that we study through kind of those observational studies with patient registries and following people over time and their habits as you report them to us. So I just wanted to put out a plug for answering surveys. When you see survey types of studies that you can participate in, this is always really helpful in helping us discern what types of environments and foods and exercise habits and sleep hygiene habits are helpful in a very long-term trending kind of analysis of HHT across diverse populations. So you want to participate in surveys if you have the opportunity that involve this type of stuff. And then we do have a webinar that is coming up in March that will speak to the different types of dietary effects on bleeding and HHT.
I'm not aware of any major studies in those areas, but I'm a big proponent of sleeping, eating, and exercise.
And your background shows it, Jim.
Yes.
I agree. I think I'm not aware of any well-designed studies to answer those questions, but it's certainly something that I consider important when I see my patients. I ask them about lifestyle factors, and we often identify on the one, on a case by case or one-on-one basis, we identify things that might be exacerbating someone's bleeding, and we try and change those things together. So I do believe that lifestyle factors and natural health products, et cetera, can have an impact on disease, on the disease. And I think it's really important to talk to our patients about that.
Thank you so much. We do not have time to answer every single question. So much information to review here today. But before we wrap up, I wanted to end with this final question. If each panelist could maybe go around and give one short answer, that being, if you had one message to leave the HHT community with here today, what would that be? It could be related to participation in clinical trial research or otherwise.
Well, since I think all three of us will say that, I will say that. And that is, I mean, Jim's already made that point. If people don't participate in research, we don't get answers. And I hope that we've presented some information that will help allay any concerns you have about participating in clinical trials in terms of safety. We really need you to be in our trials, not just for yourself, but as has been mentioned, for your family. I really appreciate the testimonies of the two patients tonight who really, that's more effective than anything I could say or any of us could say, is hearing your stories. So don't be afraid to speak up and tell people about your experiences, good or bad, and be vocal. Talk to your congressman, all these things.
I guess I would sorry.
No, you're okay. You can go.
I guess I would just say, I saw a lot of general questions about genetic testing and other things unrelated to the research and liver AVMs and things like that. If you're not going to an HHT center, go to an HHT center, even if it's a 5, 6, 7 hour drive. I've almost never had somebody travel very far to see me and they weren't happy that they came to that visit. So it's well worth the visit.
Yeah, I think just to echo that for sure is just not only does it better yourself, but you're bettering the community. And as long as you keep well lifestyle habits, I think that'll also just better yourself as well as better like the HHT that you have.
And I would follow up and say, if I can give a message, is don't give up. I mean, this condition, there's not a lot of cures, treatments, whatever it is, that have been proven effective in the past, but we're seeing and we're hearing about them today. And there's a couple, me and Anthony are examples that there are treatments that are working. So no matter how down you can be or how bad it can seem for you or somebody else that has HHT, don't give up, because there are treatments that are being proven effective. And by all means, try to get involved.
I think the biggest sentiment is just to support research by participating, and you can also advocate for research funding so that we can have the money to do these studies. The science behind this is really cool, like really super cool, and people are working very hard to try to figure this out for our patients, for my kids, for my husband. And so participating in clinical trials is absolutely imperative to advancing things forward towards a cure.
I would say join us so we can work together so that we can make progress. I think we all want the same thing.
I'll just say that working across the rare disease space, that we are learning more and more each day, and it might take many days, but every amount of effort is going towards a cure and impacting someone else.
Well said by all. On behalf of everyone here at Cure HHT, I wanted to thank everyone for attending tonight's webinar and for staying connected with us. As you've heard tonight, diseases can only be cured when scientists understand them. But without you, the patients, that understanding and ultimately advancement in drugs and treatments is impossible. We ask that you please consider participating in HHT research as clinical trials are announced or your input is requested via surveys. If you are not already, we encourage you to please sign up to stay up to date from Cure HHT to receive our emails and communications as we frequently announce updates and news related to new and upcoming trials. Again, I want to thank all of our speakers for volunteering their time tonight. This program has been recorded and will be posted on our website for viewing at a later date. We truly appreciate everyone's participation. Have a good night, everybody.
Bye.
You.
Thank you.